WM was not a man for travelling. He rarely visited David or Juliet and his grandchildren.
Well, he'd come to every house we had and checked it over, and then he didn't come again. And then he couldn't wait to get back to South Wales. My granny used to come up a lot.
David is the eldest of 3 children. Next is Windsor, seen here as the magician, who followed his father and worked at Barclays Bank. He also took early retirement after becoming manager of a branch in Wales. He married Margaret, seen here on the left, who was also from Glynneath and also worked in the bank. They have one daughter, Jill. Barry is the youngest child of Daniel and Bernice Nicholas by a good few years. After going to school locally, he got a job with Bibby's and moved to the outskirts of York. There he married Linda and they had Kirsty. Linda died from leukemia in the 1990s. David was working on the Daily Telegraph newspaper on a sweltering Father's Day on the 20th of June 1959. Dinner was liver and onions with mashed potato, followed by gooseberry pie. That was the night David and Juliet became mum and dad for the first time, when Helen was born. Named after a Roman empress, the name Helen, definitely not Hell, was never in question. However, when officially registering her name, Helen had no middle names, but was quickly supplied with Anne and Elizabeth, after her grandmothers. Both mother and daughter had to stay in an isolation ward for an extra week when they suspected Helen might have mumps, but it was a false alarm.
It was run like a proper hospital, Lewisham. You know, nurses' uniforms, starched aprons. Now you don't know whether they're the cleaners or whether they're the doctors. And she'd bring him in a tray of coffee for sandwiches. He worked on the Telegraph. Do you remember? Mm. And then in the evening, the first one in to see me was John Brox. Nobody knew who the father was.
While living in a rented flat at Elliot Place in Blackheath, there was another family event. This time it was the christening of Helen Ann Elizabeth Nicholas. Most of the grandparents turned up, and Barry was also present for the occasion. It is likely that Helen was feeling extremely sick by this point. On April 11th, 1960, David Nicholas made a life-changing decision and joined a new fledgling television news company called ITN. It was the start of a very successful career. Starting as a sub-editor, he was soon the deputy editor, although further promotion was to be a long time coming.
I didn't get the job of editorship. The editorship went to a colleague and friend, Nigel Ryan, who was junior to me in ITN. So it was a big disappointment at the time. But in a way, it turned out to be a blessing because I was then able to, I was deputy to Nigel for 12 or 14 years, and I was then able to get involved in production of big programs like the Apollo space programs, American elections, and general elections, and so on.
In the small hours of Friday, the 10th of August, 1962, James was born. The birth was uncomplicated, and Juliet came out of hospital the next day. But it seemed that James was only happy sleeping when being driven around, and even then in the boot of the car. Being more prepared, James was officially named James William David Nicholas. There was a big scare at the time with a new drug called thalidomide, but it soon transpired that Dr. Thompson had not prescribed that drug. When James was only 4 months old, the Nicholas family moved out of the rented flat at Elliot Place to Sunnydale Road in Lee Green. The purchase price was £4,400. When Helen and James were still young, they would be taken to Wales as part of their summer holidays. There, the grandparents, as well as aunts and uncles, would look after them, teaching them how to cook potatoes, tickle trout, catch frog spawn, and take them to explore the multitude of caves and waterfalls surrounding Gleneath. They were often joined by Windsor and Margaret and their daughter Jill, who lived near Tenby. They also spent time at 5 Aylesfield Close, which is where Granny and Key lived. James would sometimes help Tudor at the stores and on the lorry and go out on rounds.
I can remember one time that you went with Tudor to Hereford, I think it was, to fetch a load. And when you came back, you went over to Grandma's, and Key, as you used to call him, asked you, had you had a good trip? And you said yes, and we had to sleep on the way back. And Tudor felt like kicking you under the table because Key didn't believe in things like that. I used to love to see him counting the money at the end of the day. Key be counting the takings. And I think you were very taken with all that.
As well as the summer holidays in Wales, Helen and James were also taken on holiday to Europe. On this particular holiday, the Nicholas family had driven down to the south of France in a Ford Anglia. But it clearly shows the dedicated training that was already being invested in the future of their children. But some holidays didn't necessarily end as well as they could have done.
You should have seen my mother's face when she found she lost her case. Tears and frowns and even a curse, but luckily she had her purse.
Grandpa and Grandma Nicholas were part of the congregation filmed arriving at Margam Abbey in South Wales. They were there to see Judith Morgan, the only daughter of Avril and John, get married to Tom Reddings. They watched as Uncle John, as he was known, escort his daughter Judith down the aisle. Helen and Jill, the daughter of Windsor and Margaret, were bridesmaids.
There was one little lad there who wanted nothing but chips and beans, and that was James, 3 years old.
By 1966, the Nicholas family had been living in Sunnydale Road in Lee Green for nearly 4 years. This is where James celebrated his 4th birthday. But it was time to move to a bigger house, and there was one in Blackheath at 103 Kidbrooke Grove. After a long and painful fight against pancreatic cancer, Grandpa, Daniel Lewis Nicholas, died in Neath Hospital in 1970. He was buried on the outskirts of Pontneath Vaughan. He was 69 years old. 3 years later, still working at the age of 81, after a brief illness, W.M. died at home at Earlsfield Close. In 1977, to celebrate their silver wedding anniversary, David and Juliet returned to the spot where they had made their vows 25 years earlier. After completing her A-levels at the Blackheath High School, Helen went on to spend 3 years at Hull University, where she received a 2-1 in American Studies.
Helen Ann Elizabeth Nicholas.
In 1982, the Queen honoured David.
And ITN's editor and chief executive, Mr. David Nicholas, was invested with the CBE for his services to television.
In 1983, James quit his job as a stills photographer in a Fleet Street news agency and went to live in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US, to work for CNN. A few months later, Helen went out to stay with James on holiday, but she went and got a job with ED&F Man in New York. James stayed in Atlanta for 3 years before returning to the UK. Helen has lived in the US ever since. In 1985, while David and Juliet were in a car on their way to Heathrow to visit Helen and James in the States, Windsor phoned to say that their mother, Elizabeth Bernice Nicholas, had died suddenly of a heart attack. She was 79 and was laid to rest next to her husband, Daniel Nicholas, overlooking the mountains of Brecon. On the 28th of February 1987, Helen Nicholas walked down the aisle at Betchworth Church in Surrey, and left as Helen Ford, the wife of Robert Ford.
And their two have given and pledged their troth either to other, and declared the same by giving and receiving of a ring and by joining of hands. I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
When Helen and I walked down the aisle together 25 years ago this year, it's incredible to think that you guys had already been married 35 years. We had an amazing wedding with my mother and brother there. I was sad that my father couldn't be there, having passed away in '73.
In your speech, you said this. You said, as any veteran husband knows, the secret to longevity in a marriage is self-sacrifice. And I've yet to see that from Robert, but as far as I can see, the self-sacrifice comes from both sides, from you and her indoors.
I remember vividly one of David's comments at our wedding when he spoke was telling me that Helen had a look that could chill a martini at 100 paces, and funnily enough, she still hasn't lost the ability to do that.
In 1989, David was awarded a knighthood in the Birthday Honours List. From now on, they are to be known as Sir David and Lady Nicholas.
But David, can I say on behalf of all of us, what a great honour it is. I think first and foremost for you. You would probably say it's an honour for ITN. That is actually totally untrue. It is an honour for you and for nobody else. And if there is for anybody else, I think it's for Lady Nicholas, Juliet, who's been at your side for all these many years at ITN. Yeah.
And before he says it's an honour for ITN, let me just try to say that we wouldn't have got the news at 1, we wouldn't have got the news at 5:40, we certainly wouldn't have got the news at 10 if he hadn't been in charge, if he hadn't been the producer, if he hadn't argued for it, and if he hadn't persuaded the companies that this was in their own best interests. And so what we're really looking at is, of course for him, but for 20, 25 years in which he's made ITN what it is. I think it's about 20 years overdue.
To celebrate the honour, ITN held a big party at the banqueting hall in Whitehall, with a couple of surprise gatecrashers at the end.
Well, we wanted to end the champagne round in a rather special way. Some of you may know that David and Juliet's children live abroad. Helen and her husband Robert live and work in New York, and James and Nicholas in Sydney. For a family as close as the Nicholases, that can be a bit of a strain. So to complete our toast, we needed champagne from America and Australia, so who better to deliver them than Helen and James?
And you're then called forward, and you're briefed beforehand in that you don't bow from the waist, you just nod your head like this and then step forward, and you kneel down, and the Queen places the ribbon over your shoulders and pats you on the shoulders with the sword, and you get up. And she said to me, "Yeah, you've been doing this a long time now, haven't you? Meeting the editorship of ITN." And I said, "Yes, Ma'am." And she said, "I don't suppose it gets any easier?" And I said, "No, Ma'am, it doesn't." And that was the dialogue between us.
The day of the investiture was a special day for the whole family, as well as an honorary member of the Nicholas clan. Len Frisbee, David's driver for more than 10 years when he was editor of ITN, retired the same day that he drove the Nicholas family to Buckingham Palace.